Hi, everyone. This is the Kundalini Collective podcast, episode 3. Alan and myself, we are today talking to Linda and Michale Molina, who started the Emerging Sciences Foundation in the US and are doing important research into the Kundalini and spiritual awakening process. So what I'd like to do is, rather than talk about their work, is let them talk about their work. So firstly, hi, Linda and Michale, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Samir.
And so I guess my first question to you is, and please, this is to both of you, is could you just tell us your journey? How did you get to the Kundalini awakening space? Talk a little bit about your work, but it'd be interesting to hear your journey and the context of how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, I think I can start, and Linda, feel free to chime in. Mm-hmm. For me, the journey has been a lifelong journey, and it's been one of discovery, one of awakening, and one of scientific curiosity. So starting with, my early childhood, I grew up in, a fairly stable, decent household, and however, some of the challenges adapting to school and the pressures of sort of modern life really just were not agreeable to me as a teenager. And so by the age of about 14 or 15, I was just emotionally not 100%, happy and stable and everything like that. And so around the age of 16, I began exploring the world of the paranormal or spirituality. I began looking at things like out-of-body experiences, reading books about healing, and very quickly then adopted a morning practice that I felt would help, balance me and harmonize me and allow me to achieve fulfillment in this life. And so at the age of 16, late 16, early 17, I adopted a morning meditation practice where I would sit down for anywhere between 20 minutes to an hour each day and do a number of different exercises or asanas and seated meditation. And I continued this practice for a number of years until the age of 20, when one morning I had been meditating, and I at that point then had gotten up and gone to eat breakfast with my father, who had invited me out that weekend morning. And while eating breakfast, I was focusing on the base of my spine. And as I stood up, I felt this overwhelming sort of force rising up in my body, like a wind, or like just a strong force rising up to my head. And at that moment, my vision was completely overwhelmed or overtaken by a new vision of my body, and the sensations and experiences inside of myself basically were enhanced into a state of super clarity. And what I saw was a red orange halo around my head, like a flame, and that immediately the thought of fire or flame came to my mind. And in the next moment, that feeling subsided slightly. And I then became aware of a brilliant blue glowing, what I can only describe as an energy matrix inside and outside of my body, as if it was tethered to every cell in my body, every organ. And in the next moment, that sensation subsided, and this force kind of went back down, and my normal vision was restored. And I stood there in the middle of this restaurant looking around, and my first thought was, I wonder how much time has passed of me standing here, if anyone had noticed anything. And I looked around, and everyone seemed to be going about their business. Didn't seem to be anything that I had maybe done in that state that was absurd or anything like that. And so, just kind of bewildered, I began walking outside. And as I began walking outside this restaurant, a sensation began rising up in me of love, what I can only describe as universal divine love. It was It was a love outside of me and inside of me, emanating from everything and encompassing everything. And this sensation grew and grew over a matter of seconds, maybe a couple minutes. And at a certain point, it was as if the love itself lifted the veil of reality. And in that moment, I was then in the presence of this titanic cosmic intelligence that was spread out everywhere. It was one with me. It was outside of me. It was spread to the farthest reaches of the universe. We talk about infinity, growing up and mathematics and things like that. And this was the actual experience of infinity, at least from where I stood at that moment. And during the next 20 to 30 minutes or so, I was in this state, and there was a stream of wisdom that was coming to me during this time. Mundane experiences, seeing someone in a car that was driving next to us, and seeing that this person was the Lord of the universe, robed in flesh, completely unaware of their divine position in the universe. Things like that, or seeing my dog at home chasing a bird and realizing that if she had caught the bird and killed it, that it wouldn't have been a dog chasing a bird or anything like this. It would have been this consciousness chasing itself, and that the act of this bird's death would have been a part of this cosmic play. Things like that occurred during that time. And after about 20, 30 minutes or so, the sensation began to subside of this intelligence. And it actually felt like a center about the midbrain area, more or less around the maybe between the pineal pituitary, maybe even a little bit higher towards the corpus callosum. And that area was beginning to close. And I could distinctly feel this center closing in my brain, centered around like what people call the third eye. And as it closed, this awareness of this cosmic intelligence began to recede. And I eventually found myself in normal awareness. And my first thought was this some sort of psychotic break? Am I going crazy? And if so, why was there such a hyper realism to it? Why was there such a depth of experience? Why was I so lucid and so clear? And why were the sensations so incredibly joyful? And why was all this revealed to me? And it wasn't more than a couple weeks later that I was in a bookstore, and as I was walking through one of the aisles, it felt like a small voice called out from about ankle level, a mute voice, let's just say. And I felt this call to reach down and to pick up this book. And the book's title was Kundalini, Empowering Human Evolution. I had heard references of Kundalini in the past, and I didn't quite know what it was. But when I opened the book, the author described a very peculiar phenomenon that at that point was now very intimate to me, which was this experience of awakening, this experience of higher consciousness that was a result of this evolutionary process, he claimed. And what I found most interesting in the few minutes that I just spent scanning the book there was that he was calling for a scientific investigation of it. And furthermore, had said that this experience was a shared experience, a common experience through many, many people throughout history. So upon reading that, I immediately closed the book, grabbed it, and purchased it and began reading it. Within about a week or two, I had finished the book. And by that time, I had pretty much devoted myself to the work that the author described. His name was Gopi Krishna, and began reaching out to other organizations, the Kundalini Research Foundation, the Institute for Consciousness Research, seeing how I could help. And so I was going about that process, assisting where I could. And at that time found myself in college, involved in political progressive groups, devoted to changing and reforming the political system, the political process. And that's actually where I met Linda. So do you want to talk about any of that or how we met?
I just thought it was funny that every single time I kept saying, we need to change the system. We need down with the corporate system and down with the political system. Very anarchist perspective and views and beliefs. He would always tell me, look at me and say, no, the route to changing everything is through Kundalini. And it would always baffle me because at the moment that I met him, I didn't understand exactly what that was or what he kept, everything he would encapsulate into Kundalini. And it would sometimes just frustrate me. I'm like, why is everything boiled down to Kundalini for you? And but the more I started learning about what this phenomenon was, and I started looking back and reflecting on my own life, I saw that the elements and the pieces and experiences were there for me as well. They just weren't there for me like the way they were for Mike. It wasn't one full-blown experience that had me in this altered state of hyper reality. It was little events that happened throughout my life that just brought me to this understanding eventually. Like the book that he read, he gave it to me one day. He's like, here, take a read. And I sat there and I could not understand, not even the first sentence. And I said, there's no way I can understand this book. And I put it down. And as we kept interacting and he kept explaining more and more, very patiently, because I would get really frustrated, more and more about what the phenomenon was and how it was related to me or to all of us, and how it was important that we all understood this power that's within us, this ability that we have to change and transform ourselves and therefore the world. One day I picked up the book just to see, where I was at, and I totally understood it. And it just blew my mind. I was like, wow, I can understand this now.
Yeah. So from there, I think, after we met, and, eventually got married, had children, everything like that. One thing that stuck out to me was that there were organizations, a couple organizations only, the Institute for Consciousness Research and the Kundalini Research Foundation, that were actually doing things in the world to bring this knowledge forward. I realized that we would probably want to, on our own, start an organization very action oriented around the research. And in talking with the folks from the Institute for Consciousness Research, I asked them, I said, I would like to form this organization. It will be devoted to our work. The ICR can continue doing what they do, and we will be here to augment that. And they were very excited and thrilled and gave their blessing and eventually formed the Emerging Sciences Foundation. The mission of the organization really focused around researching Kundalini, bringing the knowledge forward, helping further the understanding of what the implications of a successful scientific investigation into Kundalini would mean for society. That's really kind of where it all started.
Thanks, Michael and Linda. That's a very interesting journey. And I think there's a lot to unpack from this, which we're going to go into. One of which is the political ramifications of Kundalini and the relationship between the political world and the Kundalini world. But before we get there, I'd like to start with your actual work. You've been doing very interesting research into the Kundalini phenomenon. And perhaps we can start with this. So first thing is, what is your research? And interestingly, how are you going about your research, and what are the findings that are coming out of this?
Yeah, so when we first started, one thing that I've always been curious about is what are the predictors? How can you tell if someone is of a certain character or constitution or profile that would make it conducive for them to have a Kundalini experience? In other words, how can you predict an awakening? And if so, if that is something that can be predicted, then also what are the specific practices, behaviors, lifestyle characteristics that would be further conducive to that awakening process? In other words, is there a way to quantify the process of spiritual awakening or enlightenment? And a lot of the research that had been done up to that point was literary research or case studies. So looking at the lives of mystics and saints and understanding what were the common characteristics, what were the characteristics of their awakening. But I really wanted to take a quantitative approach because in my mind, if you can take a quantitative approach to really anything, then in terms of framing it in the language of science, it becomes a lot easier, a lot more straightforward, and it becomes a lot easier to talk to other scientists about the phenomenon if you can show the data and the numbers behind things. So we began by looking around at work that had been done previously by others to research the phenomenon of Kundalini, looking at what were characteristics of the awakening people were looking at, what were various indications of the experience, and so forth. And we put together a huge list of potential indications of an awakening, a Kundalini awakening. We then put those indications into a survey. The survey was designed specifically to be able to analyze it mathematically. We included areas for someone to write descriptions of their experiences, but for the most part, the survey is constructed in a way that using mathematical algorithms and analysis techniques, you could apply it to the survey very easily. So the survey consisted of over 600 questions, I believe, and 268 questions, depending on how you look at it. I'm sorry, the 600 was our sample size. So it was a few hundred different characteristics or indications of the Kundalini awakening experience. And we deployed the survey online and advertised it quite heavily. And
ICR helped us as well.
Right. So as anybody who has either had one of these experiences, and for me also, it's important to collect data from people who have not maybe had any sort of awakening experience or a very minor one. So just encouraging everyone to fill out the survey, let us know the types of experiences that they've had. And once we collected all this data, we initially collected a few hundred samples from individuals. Now I think that number is closer to 600, 700 samples that we've collected. It became readily apparent in looking at the data and applying some of these mathematical algorithms to the data that there was a pattern that was emerging in the data itself. And it was a very clear signal, let's say, within the noise of the survey data that was collected. What that signal indicated was that there was a singular type of experience that people were having that had to do with the direct perception of consciousness. And when someone perceived consciousness directly, which is a thing that's very difficult to explain or even understand, and we can go into that in detail maybe later, but when someone has this experience of consciousness, that it somehow opens the door to a whole host of other related experiences. For example, when they have an experience of consciousness, they will also almost invariably have strong sensations of love. They'll have sensations of just ecstasy, so a joy that is almost inexplicable. They will have a very rapid maturation of some of their ideals and morals and things like this. There is oftentimes a transformation in personality that occurs shortly thereafter this experience. Sometimes people have the experience one time, sometimes they'll have it spread out over a longer period, sometimes they'll have it sporadically throughout their life. But this experience was very interesting because for us, it encapsulates really the core or the goal of this Kundalini phenomenon that we're talking about, which we called higher consciousness. So this amazing sort of explosive awakening, this experience being sort of the goal behind it. Once we launched that survey, the second part of it was to follow up and say, well, what about the individual may have caused this awakening to occur? What is it about their lifestyle? What is it about their meditation practices that may have brought about this experience? And so we deployed a second survey to understand some of that background, and that research and analysis is ongoing.
We also sprinkled in questions that gave clues to their political perspectives in the second survey.
Yeah, some of these, I think that's a point worth noting, because there are ways of sort of predicting someone's political bent based on how they answer certain questions. For example, opinions on healthcare or opinions on public welfare, things like this, so that if they agree or disagree, you can pretty accurately predict where they lie along the political spectrum. So those were very interesting questions as well. Yeah.
So this is very interesting work. What have you been finding then about what are the results that you're finding? So, for example, in your research, people have replied to what practices they did, and what are you finding helps a spiritual awakening process? What kind of practices or what kind of types of person seem to be having these experiences?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question. So my assumption going into this, and I think would be the assumption of most people, which is that these people who had these awakening experiences were probably, sitting there meditating really hard, and they probably did a lot of, various spiritual practices to have this awakening occur. And while there is some truth to that, in that a spiritual practice does help, one very interesting finding from the second survey, and this is just a preliminary observation, was that it was the awakening experience was less predicated on what you did more than who you are. And by that, I mean your underlying belief systems. The questions that we surveyed that had more to do with someone's perspective on themselves and the world seemed to play a much larger role than the actual spiritual practices. This led us to an interesting hypothesis, which we're actually looking to test here in the coming months and years, which is that we feel that there is an internal architecture, if you will, that is more closely associated with this experience. And by that, I mean someone who is inherently kind, compassionate, understanding, who has a universal view of humanity, who has a will or desire to improve humanity, may stand a much better chance at having one of these experiences than someone who does not. And so this internal architecture basically says there is some hidden internal construct that we're beginning to uncover, or let's say rediscover, that is very, very important to this process. So it's more to do with remolding oneself than it is sitting in meditation for 8 hours a day type of thing.
To that point, there was a few answers, and I don't have like the percentage, but there was a lot of people who said that going through the AA program, the Alcoholics Anonymous, really brought on this awakening for them. And so we looked at the steps.
Yeah, and that was an interesting observation too. And, as Linda's kind of alluding to, it's asking the question, what is it about AA that is causing these experiences to happen? And what we did was we looked at the entire 12 steps, and then we looked at our research. We looked at the lives of great saints and mystics. And one of the big commonalities there is what is sometimes referred to as humility, or the whittling down of the ego, if you will.
Surrendering.
Yes, surrender to God in the AA program is a huge component of all of the 12 steps. So it's the level to which you can accept what is about yourself, including your shortcomings, and devote your life to a higher power. Seem to be very important in terms of who is actually having these experiences or not.
And also making good where you.
Can I just chip in here? I think I mentioned this when we had a preliminary discussion some time ago. There's been some work done in England by someone called Steve Taylor, who's both a psychologist and a psychological and spiritual writer. His sample size wasn't as big as yours, which is incredibly impressive. But it was a fair sample. I can't remember the numbers, but around 90, 100 people ever. And he was looking at what the triggers were. And I mean, this sort of is in harmony with what you're saying. So for some people, it was spiritual practice, but actually that was quite a small minority. The biggest trigger he found was trauma. People going through trauma, which may relate to people who are going to AA, because in a sense, the way I view it, substance misuse can be a secondary reaction to trauma.
Right.
But also, just personally thinking about it, this idea of surrendering and in a way a sort of a cracking or shattering of ego, and I think perhaps trauma is could be said to be related to that. But just to chip in there, that say he found trauma being the biggest trigger. And
I think that's actually a good segue into sort of the mechanics behind these experiences. So we talk about the mechanism, right, behind spiritual experience being this thing that we call Kundalini. And it's an ancient Indian word that has a lot of connotations. There's a lot of superstitious sort of symbology around it. And I don't think it's a very well understood idea. I think that there's a lot out there, some of it conflicting with each other. And I think that's part of the reason why research on Kundalini is so important, so we can sort of clarify these things. The way that we look at it, and to kind of give a little explanation maybe as to why trauma or other things are present in terms of correlating spiritual experiences, is that we see Kundalini as another force of nature, let's say, like gravity or electromagnetism. There is this evolutionary energy or evolutionary dimension to life that in a human being manifests itself as this force that we call Kundalini. The way that the mechanism is hypothesized to work is that it is inherent in everyone. In other words, every human being on earth has Kundalini in them. The energy works to grow us from a single cell in the womb of our mother into a multicellular organism. It works to evolve our brain. It's the intelligence behind our growth. On an individual level, on the collective level, Kundalini can be seen as the force responsible for human evolution. And so in that context, you can look at this energy as driving every cellular process in our body. And again, it's being a fundamental force of nature. It's not something that is just constrained to human beings or even human experience. It is sort of the force behind consciousness, if you will. But if we now narrow down the discussion to the human body, one of the functions that it has is to support the flame of consciousness in the brain and in the body. And so as that mechanism, it is interfacing with the brain, it's interfacing with the central nervous system and even the reproductive system, primarily. But in the event of trauma, and specifically some sort of trauma that's affecting the central nervous system. So it could be a near-death experience. It could be severe substance abuse, this type of thing. It could even be a drug experience where the brain is the brain is now in a state where it is sort of taken off kilter, where it's sort of, and I use the word trauma broadly, right? It doesn't have to mean a car accident. It could mean a traumatic experience that someone is happening on psychedelics. But regardless of the experience, this energy then becomes more active. And the purpose of that is to effectively save the brain, to rebalance, to reharmonize the brain. And as it does so, these experiences crop up, these spiritual experiences that are part and parcel with the functioning of this Kundalini energy. And so you often hear stories of people going through near-death experiences, or even a serious physical accident, things like this. And suddenly this energy will become active, and it will elevate itself to a new level of activity. And then they'll have this experience and oftentimes be wondering what was this experience? What just happened to me? They may not even have any spiritual sort of mindset at that time. And oftentimes we even, in our survey results, heard from atheists who had the experience and said, I am not a spiritual person. I have not given thought to God. I didn't believe in God before this experience, but now this reality is undeniable to me. This expanded reality of spirituality, God, and so forth is a part of who I am. So
I would like to add that when we say God, though, it's not, this one bearded man in the sky that we want to paint a picture of. It's just this divine intelligence behind all that is. So I think that could be a trigger word for many.
Are there any other results that have come out of your research about the qualities that people have who have experienced Kundalini awakening that you found interesting?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we found both validated, I think, what we had found in terms of literary research and what Institute for Consciousness research had found as well, which is that these experiences tend to bring about a very rapid maturation of the personality. Someone would become more compassionate. They would feel themselves more compassionate, more in tune with others, things like this. But some of the things that we found were actually in contradiction to, I think, the prevailing ideas or theories about Kundalini. Most people imagine this awakening as involving, lights and sounds and sensations and vibrations, which they do. But what we found was very interesting was that people who had experiences of higher consciousness had a far less incident of these types of secondary types of experiences, lights, sounds, vibrations, sort of the classic Kundalini awakening symptoms, which sort of got us thinking in terms of, an electrical circuit. If there's less resistance in the circuit, there's going to be less indication of it running, and it will run smoothly. If you increase that resistance too much, you end up generating heat, light, sounds coming from pressure coming from the circuit that indicate that something is happening. There's an increase in power going through the circuit, but the circuit might need adjustments in order for it to handle that load that it's experiencing. So I think in the ideal case, if someone is again, like perfectly established in themselves to have this experience, when they have a Kundalini awakening, it may happen that this person just steps from their normal consciousness into higher consciousness almost without any other side effects, that type of thing.
So some people lost a loved one. A lot of people lost a loved one. And after losing a loved one, they've had just their consciousness just started expanding. Other people were doing practices daily or just started taking on personal changes, like started changing their diet or started changing who they hang around with, deciding to move on their path of becoming a better person, I guess. And so that also brought in a lot of these unexpected changes that they didn't know was part of that journey.
I've got a question about consciousness, because you mentioned earlier on that Kundalini can help you get a direct perception of consciousness. So there is obviously this link between Kundalini and consciousness. Could you unpack this idea of a direct perception of consciousness? When you talk about this, what does that mean? Because obviously when people think about consciousness, we are conscious people, and the thought would be that we already have a direct perception of consciousness because we are just thinking. So can you help us understand what that means?
Yeah, I think it makes sense to begin with how scientists currently look at the phenomenon of consciousness. So if you look at a human being as a collection of cells and neurons that are interacting with each other, there is a view in scientific circles that relates that to the phenomenon of being conscious. In other words, that what you are experiencing right now as a human is the direct product of the interaction of these cells and neurons in the brain. There are even some scientists who claim that the phenomena that you're experiencing now, in other words, your basic consciousness, is nothing but a myth or an illusion. It's like a magic show being put on by the cells in your body, and that there really isn't anything there that's substantive. In other words, when these cells and these processes end, then you die. There is another view that is far more ancient and has far more evidence behind it, that says that consciousness itself is an independent reality, that it has a universe of its own, that it has its own set of properties, its own dimension, and that human consciousness is derived from this larger dimension of consciousness, and that we are drops in an ocean or rays from a divine sun of consciousness that exists. And so that when we're born, this consciousness extends itself out into the world and in fact creates all of these experiences that we're having. And at the time of death, it then recedes back into its source and continues its evolution as a soul. These two views are very much in contradiction of each other. But I think one of the most important challenges we have in front of us is to resolve this contradiction, because it really is at the heart of a lot of the problems we are experiencing today as a society. When we say consciousness, we each have a sense of I-ness, of being me, of being a unique individual. And upon this canvas, all of these sensations are sort of coming in, streaming in through our five senses, even through our thoughts, and sort of populating this blank canvas of consciousness. In most cases, we are, in fact, in almost all cases, as individuals, we're aware of the sights, sounds, sensations, thoughts, inner feelings, emotions that we have as individuals. But the canvas of consciousness itself remains opaque to us. It remains hidden. When someone has an experience of higher consciousness or this awakening of Kundalini type of experience, and they then begin perceiving consciousness, the first characteristic that is perceived as one of a vibrant living intelligence, of some sort of other intelligent agency that exists both within the individual and also outside of them. In other words, they become in touch with a greater form of intelligence beyond themselves. And it's very difficult for an individual to accurately describe what that means. But the sensation is so powerful and so overwhelming that the sensations that we talked about earlier of ecstasy, love, these things come about as someone then steps into a realization of their own divine immortal self, a realization of this embracing intelligence that is the source of all life, the source of all happiness, the source of all joy in the world, coming from this divine sun that they are then in touch with. And so I think it's an important distinction that we need to make. And I'll just give one brief analogy to help maybe a listener understand. So a few hundred years ago, the perception was that the earth was at the center of the universe, and that all of the celestial bodies, including the sun, revolved around the earth. Galileo and others indicated that this was not the correct position, that in fact, the sun was at the center of our solar system, and the earth and the planets revolved around it, and that it was possible that maybe every star in the firmament was a similar star like the sun, and maybe with other planets around it. In a way, I think the coming scientific revolution in terms of consciousness research is going to bear forth the same level of revolution. In other words, we look at the body and the brain, the nervous system as the earth at the center of the universe. That from these neurons, we then generate our consciousness, and all of these objects around us and people around us are providing our sensory organs input for the neurons. But the other position is that consciousness itself is the center of the universe, that it is what shines out and what illuminates our entire reality, and that our brains are, in a sense, more of a receiver, like a radio receiver, or an AM radio almost, that entrain a certain spectrum of this consciousness energy, and through that process of reception, then create the reality around us, the world around us. It's a very important distinction. There are the prevailing theory is that it cannot be proven. However, I think that what is required is for us to use the appropriate instruments of measurement, the appropriate instruments of perception. And that has to be an evolved brain, a brain that is evolved sufficiently to elevate itself to a higher dimension of consciousness and make these observations directly. I think that is the only way that we're going to solve the mystery or the riddle of consciousness.
So the link between Kundalini and consciousness, according to what you're saying, is that Kundalini is a methodology for us to connect with this higher consciousness. So you used the word earlier, universal love. Is this right? So Kundalini connects us to the higher states of consciousness by kind of merging our lower self with our higher self, so we perceive the truth of everything, that everything is consciousness. Is that a summary of what you're saying?
I think so. I think if you look at Kundalini as a vehicle of exploration of the inner universe, 100%, it is. It is the energy, the mechanism, the sort of reality behind our evolution. And the way that we look at Kundalini is really, I think, two parts. The first part is this broader phenomenon that we'll call Kundalini, that you're talking about, Samir. The second part of it is something that we are hypothesizing in our research to have a very concrete physical component to it, and process within the body, something that we're calling the sapienic process. So, and the meaning being an intelligent process within the body that is an ulterior or overriding intelligence beyond the brain and beyond the nervous system. And so, yes, from a spiritual perspective, Kundalini is that bridge, if you will, between the physical and the divine, between the lower and the higher selves. It is the vehicle of consciousness, and in many ancient traditions, it is regarded as the universe in its totality. In other words, this world that we live in, is created by Kundalini itself. So.
I'll just chip in there as well. A perspective that I've had, and I think some other people had as well. I think this is complementary, really. Is that the idea of there's the self with the small s, in a way, the self that sociologically you could say is created through your interaction with the world, and there's a self with the big S, which is the consciousness, and that we've been conditioned in our society to identify with the small s, the small self, but in the reality is we are actually what part of the general self, the general consciousness, and that in that terms, the Kundalini process is a process where the person going through the process has a greater and increasing awareness that the small self isn't really who they actually are. It's more of it exists, but it's a transitory existence. But what we are is part of that general consciousness. With that way of looking at things, is that in harmony with what you're saying?
Definitely.
Yeah, it really is. I think one way to look at it, if you risk of oversimplifying, is that there is a veil or a boundary that we as human beings make between ourselves and the other or our environment. I think that one tool of perception to overcoming that veil is love. Love shows us that we are one, we are united, and not in a sort of an allegorical way or in a metaphorical way or anything like this, but in a very real, concrete way. Love is a vehicle to open ourselves, to show that we are actually one with you, that my well-being, my welfare, and your well-being and welfare are one and the same, and same for all life throughout the universe. Kundalini has often been described as the veil maker, if you will. She is the creatrix, the female creator behind this veil of reality. And so, and even in ancient Egypt, if we look at the descriptions of Isis, she essentially was equated with being one with Kundalini, that veil behind reality. And so activating Kundalini, going through this Kundalini process, is a process of lifting this veil or peering behind it to gain access to a larger vision of reality where we see ourselves one with everything. And this is kind of where, when we talk about the political or societal implications of Kundalini, this is kind of where it comes into play, because right now in the world we see a huge divergence in views. There's sort of the isolationist, self-centered views, politically speaking, and then there is the more overarching, integral views of politics. And so I think it's important for us to resolve this mystery now, so that we can firmly say which is the correct position, or what is the right mix of us considering our individual well-being and also collective well-being. So,
well, I wanted to add to that as well, just going back on the importance of surrender and surrendering. When you are stuck in the perspective of just being your little I, your own little person, and are unable to perceive how you are one with all that is, and when life and pressures start coming into you or start coming at you, the best thing that you can do is to surrender. And in the AA, one of the biggest things is surrendering to a higher force. And so I've done that practice myself, where I've had so much anger, I've had so much resistance. And the only thing, once you hit that utter rock bottom, because you're so self-centered, is to surrender, to let it go. And when you let that go and you have faith that there's something that's going to take it, like when we throw our trash at the earth takes it and she transforms it and she makes more life with it. If we trust that there's this other me that's taking care of me, and I let that go, just the most beautiful experiences can come from that and have come from that.
So I think those are wise words for people that are going through the process. So, for instance, for myself, I had initially a very difficult Kundalini awakening, really quite traumatic. But one of the big steps forward was when I just realized that all I could do was have good intentions. As long as my intention was positive, I just let everything else go. And also the idea that it wasn't so much about me, it's more about a wider perspective and doing something positive. Right. And that, yeah, and I personally concur that surrendering was actually a really, it's in a way it's counterintuitive, isn't it? Because we're conditioned to think of the internal power and ego, but actually the surrendering is crucial.
Right. And therefore, once you are surrendering, it's easier to let in the love. It's easier to give your love as well, to add to what Michael was saying on the importance of love.
It's kind of funny because I think as people, we find ourselves relying on our ego, relying on our own self-perception as sort of the source of our power. But I think, artists kind of know this inherently, and I think spirituality even more so, that by surrendering to this higher power, we are actually sort of plugging into our real power source, which is our own personal truth, our own personal creativity, love, and so forth. And so that's really the true point of power. And I think the challenge for a lot of people is it's perceived as a giving up of power, when in fact it's quite the opposite.
Thanks a lot. That's very interesting. I just want to add that surrendering has probably been the continuous ethos that I've used throughout the Kundalini awakening process, that if I ever hit a block, if I ever find this is too difficult for me, is I realize that Kundalini is a higher power and I have to surrender to the process, no matter how counterintuitive it feels. And it's always worked. It's very, very difficult, but it seems to take me through the most difficult of times. So I guess what I want to ask you is, coming to politics, is that, does it make sense for us, if we really want to bring politics into a more kind of spiritual view, to look at politics dualistically, a left or right, or Republican, Democrat, from a higher state of consciousness? We're all one, right? We're all together. What can we do then politically so that we don't get stuck in a dualistic state of mind, but we can be political? How can we do this?
If I was to go and gain audience with the United Nations or with any world power right now, and I came in front of them and I said, these idealistic principles need to be a part of your decision-making process, there would probably be some nods like, yes, we need to be kind to each other, we need to involve love in our decision-making process, but it would end there. The reason for that is because right now there is a conflicting set of priorities from a global political level. And I would say the biggest conflicting priority is around wealth, the generation, distribution of wealth in the world today. There's all sorts of different opinions on how wealth should be managed, generated, regulated. Should we be in a capitalistic system? Should we be in a communistic system? Socialism, whatever it might be. And all these buzzwords are thrown around. The difficulty or challenge there, and I think the fundamental flaw, is that we have arbitrarily decided that the accumulation of wealth and power should be our guiding principles. That there are economic ideals and philosophies, theories that say that if I seek after my own self-interest as a businessman or as a person, that I will inherently be serving the greater good. All of these philosophies are effectively derived from someone's own opinions and own worldviews. The position that we're taking is quite the opposite, and I think is more firmly rooted in an objective sort of assessment of the situation. And what I mean by that is this: if we look at this phenomenon of Kundalini and the evolution of consciousness, and if we are able to succeed in our research goals to develop a protocol and a set of predictive models, let's say, to determine what is the best course of action for an individual to reach higher consciousness, even if they may not be able to experience this higher consciousness that I'm talking about, at least evolving themselves further in that direction so that they may perhaps get a glimpse one day, or that they may live a more wholesome and fulfilling life based on these principles. If we're able to do that, and now moving it to the next step, where this awakening experience or phenomenon is proven to be, number one, evolutionary, and number two, intensely biological. In other words, through this awakening experience, someone is empirically, objectively proven to have experienced some sort of physical transformation, a transformation of their consciousness, perhaps the acquisition of new gifts, whether it be creative gifts or intellectual gifts or spiritual gifts as a result of this awakening experience. Then we have the basis to present this information to science and say, here is a huge missing piece of the evolution of the puzzle of evolution, in that humanity is evolving towards this target, that as a species, there is a predetermined target of our evolution that we are all trending towards, and that if we veer from this target, then we will experience the types of upheavals, the types of unrest, the types of inequality that we see in the world today. But that if we now turn our attention individually and collectively towards evolving towards this goal of evolution, this treasure that no treasure of the earth can compare to, this state of consciousness that a king would give up his entire empire for, and that this state is within arm's reach of the entire human race, then we now provide a new goal, a new target for the evolution of the species. And I believe that this must be communicated in the language of science. It cannot be communicated in the language of personal opinion. It cannot be communicated in the language of philosophy. It must be communicated in the most concrete way that we know how to communicate today, which is science, which is proving something in the eyes of science, demonstrating it so that there can be no doubt that humanity is evolving towards this target. Then the conversation shifts. Then the political conversation shifts. It's no longer a question of, is being a left-leaning or right-leaning correct? It becomes a question of what political processes, what economic systems help serve this evolutionary journey that we are all taking together towards higher consciousness. And so I think that itself will bear out the correct political systems, the correct social systems, the correct economic systems that can help guide humanity in the direction of higher consciousness. And from that perspective, if you just play out that scenario, it would not be something too far-fetched to imagine a world where there is a voluntary cultivation of higher consciousness in individuals. Because of their towering stature, both spiritually and perhaps intellectually, they would be in the best position to guide humanity in the direction of this higher consciousness. We're talking about individuals who would be the modern embodiment of Jesus or Buddha, and combine that with the intelligence of an Einstein or a Faraday or whatever it might be. And you have an individual who would be able to advise humanity on her path towards higher consciousness. Why? Because they are seated in that higher consciousness. They can advise on which path to take to arrive at that new estate, that new position, the other shore, if you will, the other shore of consciousness. And so that I think is what should be our basis for political decision making. But until Kundalini and this process of evolution are firmly established in the eyes of science, politics, even religion, economics, all of these things will continue to be more of a philosophical debate. And I would argue that even behind the scenes, it is more of very powerful individuals, the wealthy, the hyper wealthy, pulling the strings for war and peace across all lands, across all cultures, across all economies, and that we need to establish a new set of guiding principles so that we can rein in the power. And the reason I say this primarily is the last point I wanted to make is, for anyone who has gone through an awakening experience, they know that this experience is not easy. It is very difficult. Even after my initial awakening experience, it took 2, 3, 4 years to finally stabilize into a state where I felt grounded and whole, and integrated as part of this experience. And so it is incredibly difficult for the individual. It would be incredibly difficult for the larger humanity as well. And I contend that it will take every ounce of resources, every human being contributing all that they can to this effort to allow us to navigate to the other shore of consciousness, to higher consciousness. And that in our current order, there is so much waste of personal talent, so much waste of resources, so much misallocation, that it would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for us in our current state to navigate towards higher consciousness collectively as a species.
My kind of final thought about this then is that what you're saying is that to achieve a real political revolution, we need to have a spiritual revolution happening simultaneously. And in some ways that has to come first, or at least it has to be quite substantial, because we can't politically change until we actually change inside ourselves, right? And this inner work is a spiritual journey. And
a scientific revolution as well.
Yeah. So what your work would be doing is to help society recognize how important this spiritual journey is, but through science.
Just a couple of points, just a couple of comments, and then I've got a question. Now, what you're saying, I very much relate to. I've always thought the problems that humanity has created, and obviously, we're hitting crisis point with climate change, environmental damage, extinction of species, is we've created these problems because of the fundamental misunderstanding of reality, and people being driven by individual greed and status and so forth. It's interesting. I studied sociology, and I've studied Marxism to a certain level. And Marxism I see it as a really fascinating critique of the society we live in. Not necessarily having all the answers, but a very interesting critique. And in Marxism, there's a concept, if you have underlying an economic system, then the economic system is like a pyramid. That's one way to look at it. It creates a political system that meets that economic system. And also within that, within its hegemony, domination, it creates a way of thinking and sort of an intellectual reality that fits the system. So for instance, people being driven to consume and being driven to be ambitious and greedy, in effect, oils that economic system of production and so forth. And we've come to a point where that has ceased to be sustainable because of the massive damage it is doing. So to me, what's the interesting question is, how do you attack that dynamic? How can you actually shift that system so it's a system that is based on necessity, love and cooperation and sustainability, rather than selfishness and greed, individual accumulation? I just think it's really, to me, the really interesting point. Can you change it actually from that point of, I guess, consciousness? The people's views that have been conditioned to oil the system. But if you can increase people's consciousness, then people will realize, actually, it doesn't matter if I get a brand new car next week, it makes no difference. And the people, it's more important. So I suppose what I'm saying around that way is, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think, to me, the crux to whether humanity can tackle the crisis it's created is if we can increase awareness, spiritual awareness, consciousness quick enough to tackle the problem. So that's something I'm just to concur with what you're saying, really. But then the question is, how do you actually do that? What can you do to increase consciousness and awareness? That to me is the big question, which leads me on to ask you a question about science. Could you say a bit more about how you could, to increase this awareness and consciousness, how you could actually communicate in a scientific way, the reality of the Kundalini and the greater consciousness? How could you actually demonstrate that scientifically? Could you just say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that there's going to be a number of levels or layers to this. And I think a good analogy might be, or bad, however you want to look at it, is the way that the Manhattan Project was structured. The secret project during World War II to create an atomic weapon for the war. This was an area of investigation that required a layering of different technologies, from metallurgy to be able to mine the vast amount of material needed to create a fizzle amount of uranium, and then enriching that into plutonium and so forth, along with explosives to crush the weapon, delivery devices, how to get it to do what it needed to do. There was a huge amount of effort from various fields that were layered, and the enrichment process took quite some time. Even the mining of the material took quite some time. I think the science of Kundalini will, by necessity, unfold in the same way. So at the first layer or level is sort of the gathering of the raw material, the ore, and the enrichment process. That specifically relates to the collection of data, the acquisition of a large number of individuals willing to involve themselves in the research and submit their data, so that we can learn what are the characteristics, attributes, what does the predictive model look like behind achieving an awakening, and also what does the awakening look like in more detail, from a purely psychological standpoint, and subjective standpoint. And I think that's really the first layer. That's more of the theoretical layer behind it, but it's also a very practical layer, because it would provide individuals a set of guidelines, or at least a programmatic approach to achieving higher consciousness. Now, achieving an actual, let's say, reaction, using the analogy of a nuclear explosion or a detonation, would be, to me, is equivalent to this acquisition of higher consciousness. It is quite literally an explosion of consciousness where the consciousness extends out and now has acquired new proportions, that much more vast proportions. When this occurs, there needs to be a collection of hard physical data to back up the subjective claims. And I think science is now in a position to do so, both from a functional imaging perspective, as well as the what I'll just call molecular or composite analysis. So things like gathering samples from a metabolomics standpoint. So in the body, there are hundreds, if not much more, what we call metabolites or chemicals in the body that are related to every single process that goes on within us, from cell generation to hormones and things like that. Currently, there are in a standard metabolomics panel, there are anywhere between 500 to 900 different metabolomics compounds that can be tested for. I think science only knows what maybe a couple hundred of these, maybe up to 400 or 500 of them do, and only roughly speaking. So there's quite a bit about the human body that is yet unknown. But these metabolomic profiles can essentially tell you if there is a higher concentration or lower concentration of these specific metabolites. Effectively, if I were to take, give blood and have one of these samples done, and Linda was, Ellen, Samir, we all did it, each of us would have a slightly different metabolomics profile. One of the things that we'd like to do is gather the same data before and after for someone as they go through this awakening experience. The goal then would be to find what I'll just call the fingerprint of God, or the fingerprint of awakening within an individual from a purely, let's say, molecular standpoint. That could be coupled with imaging, could also be coupled with research into the cerebral spinal fluid to determine if compounds are appearing there. A little bit more of an invasive process, but I think for someone who has undergone an awakening, perhaps a very important one as well. So we would want to gather a body of information that could say effectively, here is the procedure protocols that you need to use to undergo one of these explosions of consciousness, and hand that data over to science. And I think this is the critical part, not so that scientists can look at it and critique it, but so that scientists can look at it and replicate the exact same procedures on perhaps themselves or another set of subjects, individuals who would voluntarily cultivate or awaken higher consciousness. And we can say, yes, within this population, we can expect this number of people currently to experience this level of awakening predictably. And then we can also observe these specific set of psychophysiological changes occurring within them. I think that the most important outcome, aside from the scientific data, would be descriptions or depictions of this state of consciousness that people are then entering into. If you were to buy a new car every week and a mansion and a yacht every month, the satisfaction that you would gain from that activity would pale in comparison to this experience of higher consciousness. And if you ask someone who has gone through one of these experiences, if they would trade all the wealth in the entire world for one of these experiences, many of them, myself included, would say hands down, the treasure that you find inside far more valuable than any treasure of this earth. And I imagine a future state where the wealthy, the hyper wealthy, the leading scientists, the leaders of this planet would begin turning their attention towards the acquisition of this higher state of consciousness, so that the measure of wealth in this world, rather than being the number of yachts and mansions that you own, would instead be the acquisition of this new state of consciousness, bringing someone in direct contact with the source of joy, the source of happiness, the source of satisfaction and fulfillment, so that rather than trying to grasp at items in the world, they, on a daily or even minute by minute basis, can simply go to the well of satisfaction of the universe and pull that up inside of themselves and say, I have all that is required. an individual like that would differ quite a bit from the leaders and wealthy individuals we see today. They would be primarily focused on uplifting humanity towards this state of consciousness. And that is the type of ruler, the type of guide that I think humanity needs at present.
I also want to add that by doing the scientific research and seeing what are the variables that help individuals come to this state, it will be clear the environmental conditions that are necessary, because one needs to have they need to have a peaceful environment. You know, the stress, the levels of just things that we need to get done don't help cultivate this mechanism. And I would add that that's probably why a lot of people are awakening through trauma, because our current state, we are at such we are so close to self-annihilation that this mechanism is like pushing us forcefully now to awaken, so that we can see within ourselves the treasure that we have within. And one of the things that I keep thinking about before I hand it over to you, Samir, is that there's a quote that I just read. I believe it's a Jesus quote. And it says, "Seek and you shall find. And when you find, you will be
Disturbed.
Disturbed.
Gospel of Thomas.
Yes. And then you shall marvel," right? That's the Gospel of Thomas. And so I'm thinking a lot about how this all applies to our own journeys and what we're talking about here. So we're seeking and we found. And when we find, we are disturbed by the state of the world. We are disturbed by everything that humanity that's happening, you know, all these divisions, all these hate and everything like that. And also, I feel that for me, it was being disturbed at the feeling of not being able to do enough to help, or being disturbed at seeing how people fail to see the beauty that's within them. And then I marvel at the ability that I have within myself to make changes that can inspire. So also, like, not just all science, this and that, but also who we become, who these people that do awaken become, and how we can inspire others and keep lighting flames within each other's heart to transform ourselves, to move humanity forward into a better world.
And I just want to give maybe a little to ground this down, this conversation, just at least the points that I was mentioning earlier. Let's say, suppose, for example, that the research shows that, and I'll even back up further. So we know that if we look at certain indigenous cultures, Papua New Guinea and so forth, that the amount of time that they actually spend working is actually quite small. That these individuals are provided by the environment around them to the extent where an hour or two a day is all that's required to sustain them. And so they have all this free time to do tool making, rituals, ceremonies, caring for the individuals in their culture, their community. Let's just say, for example, that the research shows that we should be engaging in work, let's say maybe only a fraction of the time that we're engaging in currently, and that the remaining time should be spent in creative pursuits or in self-cultivation or in helping others. A finding or an observation like that directly related to higher consciousness would then ask questions like, well, if that is the case, how then are we to restructure ourselves economically and politically to facilitate this level of development? And I fully expect that what we will find is that a greater degree of self-care in proportion to the amount of time that we spend sustaining ourselves is what we're going to find. That an individual needs to devote enough time to being in solitude, to being in nature, to reflection upon oneself, to appropriate diet, to appropriate exercise, behaviors, these types of things, more so than regular sleep is a big one than we devote to ourselves today. So then the question becomes now, how do we remold society in such a way? It could be, for example, that we may find that a more localized modular way of establishing society is perhaps more beneficial, where we are looking at local foods, local communities, local, just local in general, from an economic, political, et cetera, position, may be more beneficial for us to modularize society in such a way. And these things would be ongoing, never-ending conversations in terms of how we can improve our society. But the starting point, the catalyst for all of this, I think, should be this scientific investigation and discovery in the modern age around Kundalini.
Thanks, guys. It's such a fascinating conversation. I'm going to wrap up now in the hope that we do a second part at some point. We can carry on. But I'm going to summarize first of all. So effectively in this conversation, what I've learned, or what I'm learning from you guys, and I guess we agree, is that consciousness is something that we can experience in a higher level. Kundalini is, let's say, the name of a process that can help us experience this. And everyone has the opportunity, or could have the opportunity, to experience it. People like yourself, Michael and Linda, who have had glimpses of this universal love, this higher state of consciousness, are now trying to bring it to people around them collectively and individually. And that's what you're doing with the Emergent Sciences Foundation. What I find fascinating, and I think I'll bring my economics background into this, is that you're trying to create value in this idea, that what you're saying is that society doesn't necessarily allocate the resources towards the idea of Kundalini or inner work because it doesn't value that. We value other things. But actually, with your work, if you can prove this scientifically, you can start to show the value within this process. And then that will allocate resources. And I think when we spoke about this politically, what we're seeing is that in order to really have a political revolution, we need to create value in a spiritual revolution, right? And that's what your work is doing, is how can we put value here? And I guess people like us have organically come to this. And what we all want to do is spread the word to show that there is actually something substantial here. There is something real, and you can't have a true political revolution until you allocate resources towards the spiritual and the inner. And I think that's what you guys are great at doing. And I think that's what we want to do at the collective as well. I think that's where we're at. And what I hope is that maybe we can have a second conversation at some point in the future. We can carry on this conversation. But with this particular podcast, what's good is that I think we had a really good introduction to your work. There's a lot more we could ask. There's a lot more we can go into. But Alan, do you have any other thoughts?
I really enjoyed the conversation. Very much enjoyed the conversation. It's really good to hear in more detail what you're doing and what's behind what you're doing. Something I find really reaffirming is that whenever there's a conversation with people, I guess there's a spiritual awakening community, really, isn't there? That we've all been going through a certain process. I find it really refreshing that the conversation goes from the individual to the global, and I personally feel this is absolutely crucial, and that I mean, as individuals and small groups, we can only each do so much, but to me it's so important that we do all we can do to increase awareness, and that at this particular time, if humanity doesn't increase spiritual awareness and consciousness, then we won't be able to tackle the problems that we've created. So I can't think of anything more important to actually be involved in. And it's really great to hear about your perspective. And I really hope that your work progresses and as quickly as possible, to be honest, because actually time's running short, isn't it?
Right.
But no, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I feel the same way. And I just wanted to mention, yes, time, I feel intuitively time is running short. We're very quickly reaching an inflection point where it's either going to be nature who corrects us or it's going to be ourselves. And I would prefer that humanity do this voluntarily. To that end, what we're doing now is we're going to be starting up a new group, a new protocol within the Emerging Sciences Foundation and inviting spiritual practitioners from around the globe to help participate in a massive data collection effort that will involve taking on certain practices, recording data as sort of the next phase in our research. So we'll be beginning those sessions here soon, but I would just like to invite you both and anybody who's listening or watching this to participate. You can visit emergingsciencesfoundation.org and sign up on our mailing list. Then there'll be information on the website about this new effort. We're initially calling it a transformative experience, and this is something that is again part of our research protocol. So anybody wanting to join, please feel free.
We'll put your website details in the notes of the video, and we'll also on the Kundalini Collective website we're going to list you and etc. So yeah, we're very happy to promote anything you're doing. Please let us know, and we'll keep plugging your work. It's really great to talk to you today, and let's catch up again soon. But thank you very much for all your hard work, and we look forward to speaking to you next time.
Definitely.
Thank you both, Samir
very
and Ellen.
much.
Cheers to you both.